This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds. I've been challenged recently by the immense flood of reporting and opinions regarding the collapse in Surfside, Florida, of that tragic condominium. Tragic because so many people should have and could have escaped, and so many people have obviously died. And I want to pick up, first of all, on one comment made by a reporter and reproduced by other reporters that actually found a way, and this is perhaps reflective of politics in Florida generally, to blame socialism, I kid you not, for the collapse. Here's how the tortured reasoning went. The reporter explained that part of the problem was the fact that in a condominium building, that's a building in which individual tenants are actually owners of the apartment, but of course the apartment is in one building alongside many others, so that some measure has to be found, some way to make collective decisions. Everyone is a collective member if you define the collective as the people living in the building, and they have to work it out. And so there's a co-op board, you see, and it's elected usually, and the board has all kinds of powers to manage the shared, the collective affairs of all the people who share the fact that they live within the same building. This notion that because there's a collective activity beyond an individual or a family somehow puts you in the place called socialism is a frightening example of the ignorance of what this term means. None of these people are ignorant, so you have to ask yourself, why the ignorance about socialism? And of course, the answer is that for the last 75 years, the United States has been a hysterical place in terms of demonizing socialism, communism, Marxism. Almost any critique of capitalism could get you in trouble as being somehow weird, disloyal, strange, crazy, or some combination of all of them. So that's the excuse I provide for the silly reporter who blamed socialism. But just in case others might be tempted to go in that direction, let's take a look at some other examples of collective decision-making, where groups of people make decisions because they have to, since they inhabit the same space and share a dependence on these decisions that have to be made, and see whether you find them socialist. Most of the business done in the United States is done by something called a corporation. You may think that the ultimate decision maker is an individual, for example, the CEO, but if you think that, you're wrong. Every corporation has to have a board of directors. Notice the plural, directors. Typical size of a board of directors in the United States is between 10, 12 at the low end, 20 or more at the high end. It is a collective decision-making apparatus. You know what it's kind of like? It's like a board of a condominium. It's elected by shareholders in the case of a board of directors. It's elected by condominium owners in the case of a condominium apartment. And the decisions made by the board of directors shape the life of the people in that corporation, just like the decisions of the co-op board shape the lives of the people there. Would you call corporations socialist? Well, there are some people who stay consistent with this level of ignorance and do so. And that would, of course, mean that since the United States is overwhelmingly dominated by a couple of thousand of corporations that do the bulk of the business, then we are certainly a socialist society, contrary to what the vast majority of Americans think. But enough of that kind of nonsense. The irony of what the Surfside disaster shows us is the problem of not recognizing what socialism stresses. And that idea of socialism is simple. If a decision affects large numbers of people, then the large numbers of people must have a say in making those decisions. That's what democracy was all about. That's what it means. Socialism is the desire to extend democracy to many parts of society from which it has been excluded. So, for example, a socialist does not support boards of directors and corporations. Why? Because the vast majority of people in every corporation are the workers who do the work, the employees. In many large corporations, they number in the tens of thousands, while the board of directors, as I mentioned, has 10 to 12 to 15 people on average. And you know who else is affected by corporations? The people who live near them, the family members of the workers who work in them. Because they're all affected one way or another by what the corporation does and doesn't do, in a democracy of the sort socialists advocate, they all would have some say, whereas in our capitalist system, they are all excluded. Those 10 to 20 people on the board decide what the corporation does, what it produces, what technology it uses, where it carries out production, and what is done with the profits that all the workers have helped to produce. It is a restriction of democracy, a denial of democracy to exclude all those people. And now let me end by showing you how this applies to the Surfside disaster as well. The people affected by the decision of that board, in this case, not to make the structural improvements that an engineer back in 2018 told them were necessary. That board made that decision. That's a board elected by only the people who live in that co-op. But you know, it shouldn't have been. We may discover, because we don't know yet, that among the people killed in that collapse were, for example, work people who might have been in there at that time, or children that were enjoying a sleepover, children from another part of town, from another building, who might have been visiting and staying overnight with their friends in a family in that building. The whole community is at risk if buildings are not maintained. And even if there wasn't, in this case, a repairman or woman, a visitor, a child, every one of you and I know it could have been. And next time it will be. The decision about maintaining a building is a social decision because it affects everyone. And everyone should have been involved. And that, of course, raises the question, if everyone's involved, then everyone maybe should, let me dare say it, be involved in funding the building of buildings, the maintenance of buildings. Maybe housing should be a social responsibility. Maybe that's the only way to make it democratic and to make it safe. To give you an example of how this might work, let me explain that 100 years ago, the socialists, who were the government in Vienna, Austria, that country's biggest city, decided exactly to make housing social. And to this day, half of the apartments in Vienna are either run by the government or run as a partnership between the government and the private sector. Socialized housing, socialism in housing, and I invite any of you to travel to Vienna, look at the quality of their public housing, and weep that we haven't been able to do the same in the United States. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.